Hey, welcome to the video. Thank you so much for joining. Please subscribe if you haven't already. Now let's talk about drums. Okay, I got some beats here. I'm going to run through them. And the question is that I get sometimes, how do you get your drums to sound punchy? I think the only answer that I have is separate volume, separate the samples from the drums as much as you can. Okay, so whenever I'm making beats, I make sure that the drums are the center of my mix. I typically do start my beats with the drums. Okay, so drums come first. Then whenever I bring in the samples, I make sure that I always have my samples lower than the drums. It doesn't mean that certain beats will sound in the end different, because as I bring in the samples, and if I feel that the samples are really nice and it works better if I have the drums lower, they will be lower in volume. But typically when I make beats, the drums are always the center of the mix, and I do tend to keep my samples lower than the drums. So let's hear some of these beats. Okay, so in this case, the drums are louder than the samples. You know, they do knock. There's a bit of a difference in volume, but not too much. I got beats that are they have a really huge difference in volume between them. This one, even though the drums, I could lower the sound of the drums here a little bit more. Right. I even like this. I like this better, and I've lowered the sound of the drums. So the entire track, I have my hats, my kick, my snare, all the drums on the same track. I can't individually change the sound of the hits, of the individual hits, because each pad has its own volume. So I can mix inside of the track. I can mix all my volumes. So in this case, I've lowered the entire track, the entire sound of the drums, the whole drum set, by 3 dB. And I kind of prefer this than the other one. So some beats will have the need for the drums to be punchy. Other beats will have the need for the samples to, have more presence and not be overpowered by the drums. It really depends on the beat, and it's a subjective thing. It's a preference thing, right? Each one will have its own way of getting around it. But if I want that punchiness, there's no tricks. There's no magic tricks. It's all volume. Do you use sidechain? That's the question. No, I never use sidechain unless I have a problem with my low frequencies. Then I will get that. I will get the sidechain to make sure that my kicks cut through the mix. So this was one beat. Let's hear another. In this case, let me lower the sound of that kick. There's always the thing that, when I'm mixing and I'm putting, making these mixes, I do a rough mix of the beat on the MPC. Then I run everything through my compressors. And once it hits the compressor, all these kicks, they get ducked down, right? They get lower in volume. The mix gets, because I'm compressing everything, so that difference between volumes gets squashed, right? It gets closer together, the sound of the kicks and the samples, they get squashed together. So there's always that, and I always end up mixing with my outputs, meaning that I'm on the compressor and on the MPC at the same time, going back and forth, adjusting levels to make sure that everything sounds close enough to what I want it to sound. So in this case, without the compressor running, so it's just giving colors, not compressing, I can just lower the sound of this kick a little bit. Right, so here the kicks are not really pronounced, and they don't need to be, all right? I kind of want it to sound like this, okay? But you can increase the sound of the entire drum set if you want. Let's just hit. Let's try another beat. Right, cool. So here on this beat, there is a difference here in volume. The main thing about this beat are the drums. And then all the rest of the samples, they're brought in, but there's always a difference in level. That's pretty big. That, you know, just lets the drums stay up front. Right. So once it hits the compressors, the things change. So once it hits the compressor, especially these VCA compressors, the kick gets controlled, gets pushed down, and the whole mix gets controlled. Let's say it gets leveled out, you know. But the drums, they stay overpowering the samples, because that's what I want in this case. So it's a little trick that I do, which is in the mix, make sure the drums are loud, and once it hits the compressors, the compressor squashes everything together. It glows the mix. It pushes the drums down and increases the sound of the samples. It brings the sound of the two things together. And that's it. I mean, to me, if you're asking me how do you get your drums to sound punchy, the answer will always be volume. It's a theme here on the channel. I keep talking about volume because that's all I do. I'm a very minimalistic guy, and my approaches to beat making have always been like this. I've been on. There was a time where I was trying to bounce everything to the DAW and EQing and doing all sorts of engineering work, whatever it was, which I hated, and I just kind of stopped doing all of that and just focus on volumes. And I'm just way happier right now just by doing this. And it works for me. It works, okay? I'm not going to win any Grammy or anything, but the sounds that I want, but the way that I want my beats to sound, I'm happy with, okay? I'm happy with this thing. And then when it gets to this punchy sort of drums, how do I get there? It's just by separating the volumes. I start my beat with the drums, okay? And then whenever I bring samples, I make sure that the samples are not like on top of the drums. I don't want that. I always bring the volume down of the samples, and I start my music like that. Okay, so I have my drums right here. Let's say I started the beat as I do, make my drums. Now, if I want to bring samples in here, whenever I bring in a new sample, okay, I got some samples right here. I'm going to load these. Right, whenever I bring samples in, I automatically just lower the sound of the samples. Right? Bring in other set of samples. Let's try another thing. Right? Let's bring that in. I'm always careful with this because right now I feel like the samples are overpowering the drums. I'm lowering it by 10 dB right now. And of course, this is a rough sketch, but I don't want the samples to cut my drums in the sense that they're just louder than the drums. So then as I progress, as I make the beat, if I want the samples to play at the same volume, they will play at the same volume. There's no rule to this, but if I want my drums to stay up front, it's just a volume thing. So, you know, there we go. Like this is a good example as well. The drums are still in front. You can still clearly hear the kick. You can clearly hear the snares and all of that. The drums are not buried in the back. It's because all these samples are lower in volume and not overpowering the drums. It's just a volume thing for me. I could even lower the sound of the main samples a little bit. And I think that there's a little barrier there. There's a certain threshold where if I lower the sound of the samples too much, it just becomes like the beat, the drum loop is just naked without any sort of sample around it. So there's like a threshold in there which is just too much. So I tend to leave my samples there. Okay, so yeah, I got my, it's about a difference of 10 dB here with the between the drums and the samples. Okay. The trick here is to keep that contrast between samples and drums just by using volume. That's how I achieve it. And it kind of works for me. I know other people have all sorts of techniques to make sure that the drums sound a certain way. To me, I'm a very minimalistic dude when it gets to making beats. I really just love chopping and making beats and stuff like that. I hate to sit around and EQing and doing all sorts of engineering work. So as long as I can get away with volume and all of that, that's how I do it. You hear my music, it's always just a matter of volume. Trust me, there's no extra trick that I do around this. It's just a volume thing. If I want my drums to hit hard, I make sure that I lower the sound of the samples and let the drums be in front. Okay, that's it. That's all I do. And then of course you got the compressors on the output. I've showed it many times. I'm not hiding anything. There's no little trick behind that I do. I could, let's say, I'm going to lower the sound of the drums, so I'm just going to push it down. It doesn't sound bad. I lowered it by 10 dB, no, close to 8 dB, right? So it still sounds good. There's nothing wrong with the mix. You might even prefer this than the other one. So it's just a question of how you want your beats to sound, okay? This or this. It's just two different tastes, in my opinion. Right. Again, hear the drums in this beat. I prefer the drums just to be very low. I just want the samples to take the front. Okay, but the drums are still there. You can still hear the kick. You can still hear the snare quite well. They're not buried in the mix, but they're not taking the front of the mix as either, right? They're just there kind of working with the samples, but the samples are the main thing in this beat. So, and this is all done through just volumes, okay? There's no side chaining, there's nothing, none of that I use. Sometimes I have samples that you don't even know they're there because they're just in the back, just changing the harmonics a little bit, carrying a bit of flavor in the back. They're just in the back, really hidden, buried in the mix. But if you take them away, you'll notice it. You'll notice it, but you don't really tell because they're not in front of your face. I think that's the trick with mixing, is that you can't, just because a sample is good, it doesn't need to be loud in volume, okay? And if you get used to this of making sure that you contrast between samples, you get a really big contrast in volume between samples, then you'll find mixes that are really beautiful instead of having everything boom in the front, because you need that contrast in the mix, I think. All right, I hope that this was somewhat informative, and if you haven't tried this contrast in volume between samples, try it. You'll see that your drums are gonna be knocking and just punchy a lot more than they were, just by volume. All right, cool. Thank you so much for watching, man. Have a great day. Let me know how you get your drums to sound punchy. What kind of tricks do you use? Because I know a lot of people use different tricks when it gets to making their drums punchy. So let me know, all right? Thank you so much for watching. Have a great week. I'll see you in a bit.